Let's talk.
Charles Brown.
The accidental soldier. Owain Mulligan was never what you'd call a career soldier, not even a particularly good one. At weekends, he trained with the Territorial Army and dreamt of swapping the mayhem of teaching in a tough school for the adventures of service in Iraq. At least that's what he thought, but careful what you wish for, because it has been described as a real-life catch-22. I'm delighted to say that joining me live from some obviously luxurious beachfront location somewhere in the Caribbean is the author of The Accidental Soldier, Owain Mulligan. Good morning to you, sir. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thanks. I'd have to swap that for child's bedroom in Devon, but yeah, similar in some way.
So tell me a little bit about then your background, and you were in the TA. Was that sort of thing you sort of fell into from, I don't know, doing CCF at school or something? How did that? What was the whole thing about the TA?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the Army's got a pretty good route of kind of getting you when you're a kid. So I was in the cadets when I was a child. I was then actually in the gap year. I did a gap year commission, so I was in the Army for my gap year while everyone else was on beaches in Thailand, and then kind of stayed in the reserves when I was at university. Always, just in it for the travel and the fun and the adventure and all that kind of thing. But eventually there was a bit of a requirement to pay some of that back and go and do it for real.
I mean, that must be. Is it something that is always in the back of your head, or you think, oh well, the Soviets are never going to come over, opposite against the Army of the Rhine or whatever, so I'm relatively okay here. And then suddenly that all falls apart, and there are regional conflicts or other hotspots breaking out, and suddenly you do find yourself in being called up. I mean, was that a complete shock to you, or did you have an inkling it was coming?
I mean, I actually, in fairness, it's quite interesting. I was at Sandhurst for my gap year commission course in November 2001. Right. So very shortly after, obviously, 9/11, which definitely changed the paradigm a bit. So I think the Army definitely went from we'll go to Bosnia, Northern Ireland, etc., to, well, actually, we might have to do a bit of war fighting here. I mean, by the time I deployed to Iraq, I actually volunteered. So the route was, teaching was so horrific and I was so bad at it that anything seemed like a good option, including serving in operations. The bit that was a bit of a surprise was I assumed I'd be in a headquarters somewhere or pushing pins around a map. But actually the Army was so short-handed that they had no choice but to make me a troop leader, which was not what I had in my plan.
What were you teaching, by the way? And was it sort of history or geography or PE, or what were you doing?
Yeah, kind of broad humanities. So everything from history, geography to a bit of RE. But with some of those topics, I was definitely about 2 pages ahead of the kids in the textbook. I'm a historian by trade, so it was mainly that. But I did a bit of everything. Now,
you see, historian by trade, and listeners will go, oh, blimey, here he goes, because I'm that worst sort of creature, the armchair historian. Okay, so off we go. But the thing is, and if you like to read about regiments and formations and the history of the British Army, for example. I mean, so you've got that even smaller segment of history, which is military history. And so there you are, you've been reading about, stuff happening in Afghanistan, Iran, and the whole bits and pieces from a historical context, sticking the buffs and all that sort of stuff. And the next thing you know, there you are and you must have kind of had that idea of what it would be like, in the Euphrates, Mesopotamia, all that sort of thing. And there you are, standing there going, okay, well, this wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be like.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, one thing that I did find quite interesting, though, because I'd read all those military history books, but I'd read a few which really stuck with me. So I'd read things like there's a book called 18 Platoon by Sidney Jarry, Quartered Safe Out Here by George MacDonald Fraser. And, a lot of those books are just the kind of, the humdrum, what soldiers talk about, how they kind of interact, how they kind of, complain a lot, but ultimately kind of get on with the job. And, notwithstanding that I couldn't put myself in the mindset of someone who'd been in, Baghdad or Basra in 1914, kind of fighting the Ottomans, what I found really interesting was that the way that soldiers interact and the way they talk to each other and, how they get on with the job, certainly British soldiers, hasn't changed in, hundreds of years, I would venture. It felt very familiar from, frankly, having read about it, to being in that situation and listening to the lads, just grumbling, but ultimately getting on with it. So I found that quite impactful.
Because, this is the thing, isn't it? Everyone thinks it's going to be like, the Hurt Locker or Band of Brothers, where you all say meaningful things to each other, all the time. But actually, sort of soldiering in general is basically it's long stretches of boredom filled with thankfully short, but extremely intense periods of sheer adrenaline.
Yeah. I mean, it is 90. I mean, people say 95%. I'd say 99% boredom and kind of humdrum and routine stuff, and then it suddenly flicks to quite intense situations, which I think is what sometimes makes it hard for people to come home, because then you do 100% kind of humdrum situations, but at the back of your mind, you're always waiting for the next thing to kind of to kick off. And I know it took me 6 months to a year to be in that kind of you'd be in a shop in Basra or in Camp Abenagi up in Alamara, and it's very normal. You can buy a copy of, FHM, you can buy a Snapple and buy a Twix or whatever. But as you're handing over your dollars, all of a sudden Chinese 107mm rockets are kind of landing everywhere. So 6 months down the line, when you're back home, you're buying a Twix in the corner shop, the back of your mind is still, well, hang on, is it all about to go completely sideways? So it is, it's a real kind of juxtaposition between the humdrum and the, very frightening.
And that's one of the things, because we tend to think of that region, especially because most of us don't know awful about it. So we tend to think it as being, the Tuareg campfires and dusty hilltop forts. And the fact that you can go and get a copy, get the lady, get a copy of the latest CD or going back a bit or whatever. Or like you said, pick up a Twix, and, it is a quote unquote normal society.
Yeah. And but also the army, when they train you for those kind of situations, they're very worst case scenario. So they always tell you, everything that we're doing to you in training has happened to someone in theatre in the last 6 months. But because they've got a limited time to train you, they'll pack it into, the course of 1 week, right? So you'll go from being shot at to blown up to, someone setting you on fire, because the army is very method. If they think you might get set on fire in Iraq, they'll set you on fire in a car park in Germany. So by the time you go out there, I remember the first time I went out of the gate, I kind of assumed that was it, right? Because nothing had happened in training. We'd never gone out of the gate in training without something cataclysmic happening and multiple people dying. So it takes a while to realize that, to your point, it is just, 99% of the time a normal society where people are trying to go to school or university or go to work or, take their kids out for a day out, fix their cars, whatever. And yeah, there's 1% of the time where, someone will disrupt all that by firing at, British soldiers or trying to blow them up. But, you are operating, even if you're sat in an armoured vehicle, in someone's day-to-day life, which takes a while to get used to and stop expecting the worst every time you leave.
What regiment did you go into? Who were you with? And you're doing infantry work then, so it wasn't as if you said you weren't doing a staff job pushing pins around in an air-conditioned office.
Yeah, so I was in the 1 Princess of Wales, or the 1st Battalion Princess of Wales Royal Regiment Battle Group, as part of the Queen's Royal Hussars subunit. And they had a very kind of fruity previous tour. So the PWRR, as they're known, had been in Iraq in 2004. That's where they'd won the Victoria Cross. So Johnson Bahari won his Victoria Cross for driving his Warrior armoured vehicle through an ambush. So, that didn't help my kind of expectation of an apocalypse, because the last time that unit, the unit I was in, had been in Iraq, they'd won Victoria Crosses, military crosses, Distinguished Service Orders, etc. So, we were kind of infantry style battle group on the ground, and with a battle group that had done some of the hardest warfighting since Korea, 2 years previously in the same place.
And so, you don't get that sort of decoration for having nicely clean windows and pointy shoes, do you?
They don't. Yeah, they don't hand out those. They certainly don't hand out Victoria Crosses lightly. And that battle group or that unit won a lot of gallantry awards. So luckily our tour was quieter. I mean, it had its moments, but it wasn't a Victoria Cross winning tour. Thank goodness. What's
this is going to sound like a bleeding obvious question, but what's the feeling like then that first time that you form up and then you step out of the security of the base and you go off on a patrol? Because people go, "Oh, you're blasé," but again, you're expecting, because you've been set on fire, shot at, blown up, etc. But this must be like, the first day you step onto a rugby pitch for a new team, multiplied by 500, basically, because you have trained with your unit, your platoon, your troop, whatever. But this is for real. So again, until you get used to it, every time somebody sneezed, you must have leapt for cover, sort of thing.
Yeah, 100%. I remember the first patrol we went on, we were in the back of an armoured warrior armoured vehicle with the mortar hatches open. So myself and another troop leader were on a familiarisation patrol. And, we kind of assumed every car that would drive past us. I mean, there's no real suicide bombing threat in southern Iraq at the time, but we assumed every car that was, going to overtake us would blow itself up. I remember the other guy, kind of madly gesticulating at this little kid on a bicycle, who he also presumably thought was going to blow up. So yeah, it's 100% kind of, dread and fear and expectation. And I think the bit that, I definitely struggled with probably more than most is that everything up until that point, even those kind of rugby games and, things where you do an element of controlled risk, it was all controlled risk, right? I was, very privileged growing up and, wrapped in cotton wool and got told how special I was. And, if anything ever went wrong, someone would step in and, blow the whistle and pause the game and all that kind of stuff. And I think it was real realization that actually not only would no one pause the game, but there were people in the game who actually wanted to kill me. So, the first time I got heavily rocketed, I had a real kind of, a real moment where I just had to get into the headspace of, well, actually, even though I think I'm a nice bloke and haven't really done much, people do want to kill me, and they are trying very hard, and they're not half bad at it as well. So that was a real kind of mindset shift that I think a lot of people are better at doing, but it took me a while to get my head into. And
presumably, until you've had a large rocket fired at you, you're not sure how you're going to react. I mean, I know you've been trained and whatever, but that's training as opposed to the real experience of that. Because if you're being trained, you have the expectation you're going to get shot at or whatever when you're training. But like I said, I could be asking you something, and then suddenly, boom. And the next thing you know, chaos envelops. So until you've actually come under that sort of situation, you don't really have an idea. You can't prepare for it, can you? So that must have been quite a moment as well.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, training helps. And, I've done subsequent tours where they will go so far as to get amputees, right? So people who've lost their legs in a motorcycle accident or something, dress them up as soldiers, kind of, spread sheep's blood or gore or whatever over their stump. Then, they'll drag themselves towards you after a quote unquote IED attack. And that kind of thing, I think it does help. It gets you kind of halfway there. But the other half, which is, the bit of your kind of monkey brain that realizes actually it's not pretend anymore, it is real. I don't think you ever know how you're going to take that. Weirdly, a lot of the reason that people join the army and go on operations is to find that out, right? Like, there's always that bit at the back of our heads about, would I have got out of the landing craft on D-Day and kind of run up the beach and all that kind of thing. And I never faced anything like as serious as that. I think about the best I can say is I didn't panic. But yeah, I don't think you can ever fully control what you're going to react like in the moment.
This would have been a great book if it was just about your experiences like that, explaining how you cope with that, how your feelings are. But also you take that sort of detached view because, yes, it is. People talk about the British military, and it is an absolutely superb institution. Our fathers, our uncles, our grandfathers, of course, especially in this week, we're looking back at the sacrifices that were made. But you also take a sort of like tongue-in-cheek look at some of the things that, as I mentioned before, Catch-22, those situations where some of the higher up in command may not have a full understanding of what's going on. Some of the protocols might be not exactly tailored to fit. And some of the equipment, stroke machinery is, should we say, challenging, I mean, in a way?
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty fair. I think almost all the way through the organization, people were doing their best with, what they had to hand. And it's complex and, the situation's complex. You're trying to, run a brigade or division or whatever it is of kind of 10,000 people, which is a bit like a kind of, an ocean tanker, like it takes a while to kind of turn that. But yeah, the disconnect between what we were telling people we were getting done and the reality on the ground was, at points fairly huge. And, some of it, quite a lot of it, you have to laugh at, otherwise you would cry, right? If you get told that you're about to go and escort some doctors to a hospital to, check out what needs they've got, and then someone comes back and says, actually, lads, stand down, we've just worked out that, that's the hospital that the militia take all their wounded to, so we're trying to work out if we should donate equipment to a hospital full of people that we shot, a couple of days ago. You can't help but laugh at just the insanity of it feels very Catch-22 when you're in the moment. So yeah, there are some people I think in the higher echelons of politics, and maybe some of the generals at the time who've kind of all retired now, who probably, I say in the book, worth having a real think about what it was that they asked people to do and the extent to which that was sensible. But yeah, there's always going to be an inevitable element of chaos. And, what you can say for sure is that the blokes on the ground, the blokes and the girls on the ground did their absolute best with what they had to hand. Did
you come into much contact with our valiant allies as well during this period of time, or was it surely a British Army sort of situation? Because I know, as we know, the Americans were sort of getting involved as well, to put it mildly.
Yeah, we did. We resupplied through a couple of their bases. They provided quite a lot of the kind of the air cover. In the book, I talk about going through a kind of a US base and basically rinsing them for all the Snapples and Hershey's and other kind of food and drink that they've got. I mean, the thing about the Americans is there were lots of them. They took it very seriously and they kind of doubled down. When it turned out that they didn't know what they were doing and Baghdad was kind of spinning out of control, they learned from it. They surged. They put soldiers on every street corner and they sent out their soldiers with Iraqi soldiers in the way that we actually never did, right? We never had more than 10,000 soldiers in Basra. Once you take out all the people who are kind of, guarding things, clerks, admin, medics, etc., you very quickly got down to a couple of hundred people who could deploy at any one time, and actually at some points you'd have maybe 12, 16 soldiers on the ground in a city of 1.5 million people. That's not what the Americans did, right? They surged, they put people everywhere, they kind of enveloped the city, they enveloped Baghdad and the other cities they were after. So, for all that it's easy, and I do in the book, kind of take the mickey out of them for their kind of gung-ho and maybe simplified attitude to things, they took it seriously. And, that old adage about the British treat sport like war and war like sport, but the Americans treat sport like sport and war like war, definitely came booming through when I was in Iraq.
When you're sitting there, or you're sort of standing down, and then you hear politicians going about, we have the best military in the world, our British Army, and at the same time our forces, whatever, and at the same time they're making all these cuts. Do you sort of like cross your eyes or say, splud or words to that effect? This is because there is a sort of fallback position that we have that, and rightly so, that we have fantastic military, we have a fantastic Army, Air Force and Navy. However, it's to a certain extent, it's not helped, and it's very easy for politicians to go, well, there we are, we're sending our forces here, and you guys you're at the sharp end.
Yeah, I mean, I think the phrase "best little army in the world" has been bandied around a fair bit, but I don't think I'm saying anything controversial when I say that it is. And I've been out a long time, not that close to it. It does, outside in, it does feel little. It does feel like it's got capability gaps. Certainly vis-a-vis the kind of warfare that you're seeing in Europe today. So I think there's a lot there to kind of build with, and the British soldier, I think, is among the best in the world, but he or she does need more mates and more kind of high quality equipment to do the job, and then they'll do it well. But it is, it does feel like a bit of a gap at the moment.
So why did you decide to write the book? Was it cathartic for yourself? Was this, as Americans would say, this is part of your journey, or did you just think to yourself, I want to put this down because a period of time has passed between being at the sharp end and now the more mellow, I'm assuming, Owain, you're a different character than you were 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, actually, because I wrote a lot of emails home, and I wrote a bit of a diary, etc. when I was there. I actually kind of compiled it the year after I got home and put it into kind of book form. I didn't really get too far with it, but having reread it then, it was quite angry and probably still quite, misinformed. I think it was probably too close to the events of the tour to kind of make any sense of it. But the original intent was really just to write something down. I had a couple of paternity leaves with my children, to write something down for them to read one day and just kind of, get a small insight into what Dad had done, when he was young. Impossible as they would, I'm sure, find that. But then, things kind of snowballed, sent it to a literary agent, it then got kind of picked up. And the royalties, which are quite important to me, are going to a charity called War Child, who I worked with a bit when I was in Afghanistan, subsequent to the Iraq tour, but who will use that money hopefully for helping children who are caught up in just really difficult situations in conflict zones all over the planet. So that has retrospectively turned out to be the main reason for writing the book, to try and do a bit for those guys.
Now there are rumours of it being picked up as well as a TV or even a film. Have you heard about this? Or tell me a little bit about it if you can.
Yeah, I think it's in the works. Yeah. I think TV takes ages in any kind of situation. So I think we're still at the kind of the early stages of that, but. I'd love for that to happen. The more people I think who can hear about what our soldiers did, like what the boys did, in really difficult circumstances with, as you say, not maybe the best equipment and support, but actually continue to do, not today in Iraq, but certainly in places like Poland and Estonia, and, get that message out to people that, these people are there on our behalf now, today, for probably much better reasons than we were in Iraq. That if it gets a wider audience, because it does go on TV, would be amazing. I'd love to see that.
Here's a one. If, you've got little ones, if one of them turns around in, 10, 20 years and says, Daddy, I quite fancy I want to do what you do. I want to take up do a commission and maybe get them to pay for my degree and stuff like that. Would you say, here's the book, read it before they get involved? Or, do you still look back and think, without trying to get, again, deep and meaningful, do you think it was worth it? Do you think it's, how do you look back at that time?
I look back at it without any regrets, but I look back at it because I got away with it. And plenty of people didn't get away with it. Plenty of people, still carrying, not here anymore, not with us, or carrying physical or, in lots of cases, kind of real mental wounds. And, some of the people that I worked with, some of the people in my troupe are still carrying mental wounds from that tour that, live with them to this day. I think I wouldn't, you've got to give your children free choice. I would definitely give them the book. I'd say read it, buyer beware, just, be aware of what you're getting yourself into. I would rather you didn't, because I love you and I don't want you to get hurt. And that is part and parcel of being a soldier. But, if it's something you feel you have to do for whatever reason, then, I can't think of a more fantastic institution to be part of. Just be very careful what you wish for.
What are you hoping that people are going to take from The Accidental Soldier?
What I really hope they take is that we have a group of young men and women who do extraordinary things for us. At the time, my soldiers were being paid, some of them 16 grand a year for, a 7-month operational tour where they didn't have much in the way of downtime, and all the time that they were doing things, they were fairly cheeky things. So, the message I would like people to get is that we've got this enormously kind of additive institution, which is doing things actively to protect us from threats to our way of life, frankly, because I don't think, the Russians would stop at Ukraine if they thought they could go further. And just understand that and appreciate them, and, try and do as much as you can to kind of get behind them, because, as I say, they're doing probably a much more worthwhile job than we did in Iraq, but I suspect the circumstances of their equipment and their pay and their conditions probably haven't changed a huge amount. So we owe them a real debt of gratitude. The book is called The Accidental Soldier. It's by Owain Mulligan, I'm speaking to today. Can people find you online? Do you do the social media or the website thing? You can find me on LinkedIn. And so, unfortunately, I'm tragic in the sense I have no social media presence other than LinkedIn. But I'm certainly on there, and happy to connect and chat. And you can order the book by clicking on the link on our TRE bookstore. The book is called The Accidental Soldier. Owain, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning. Thank you very much. You too.